or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you're located. Welcome to this live stream. We are going to talk about how to go gluten-free, if that's what you need to do or feel you need to do or want to do, and tips and do's and don'ts around eating gluten-free. So if you do have questions about gluten or gluten-free, please put them in the chat and I will answer them every few minutes. I will check the chat. So thank you everyone so much for coming. My name is Debbie and I have a YouTube channel called Debbie Esplin where I do fast, easy, healthy recipes. And I also share tips and information around food, kitchen, and home. So today we're going to talk gluten and gluten-free. And if you like this content, then click the like button on my YouTube channel or Facebook. If you're watching from Facebook, give me a like. Let's get started. I have a presentation to share with you, so let's take a look at that. So these are the topics we're going to look at today. Gluten-free eating for beginners. What is gluten? What grains have gluten? What is celiac disease and what is gluten intolerance? And how much gluten is allowed in gluten-free foods? And then I'll tell you my story and why I'm doing this presentation. What foods do not contain gluten? And what about processed foods that are gluten-free? And then what can you eat on a gluten-free diet? I give you some information around that and then tips. So let's go look at the first slide. What is gluten? It is a protein. It's made of actually two proteins, glutenin and gliadin, and it's found in wheat and a few other grains. Now, gliadin is what most people react to more. So that's the protein that causes the most problems when people do have a problem with gluten. But gluten is really a fascinating thing. So if you're making bread, wheat bread, for example, or croissant or puff pastry, the gluten is what allows the bread to rise and grow, or a cake or a cookie, but still keep its structure and not collapse on itself. So gluten is so useful for baking. And we will look at that a bit more with, can you have bakery products that are not made with gluten? And so that's one of the reasons why gluten is so prevalent in so many products, because it just has the amazing properties of strength and stretch. Well, what grains contain gluten? Wheat has gluten, barley has gluten, and rye has gluten, and any of their derivatives or any products that are made with these grains. So that could include triticale, semolina, couscous, farina, gram flour, and phosphate flour. And wheat has several names. You could know it as durum, einkorn, emmer, kamut, and spelt. And why it's important to know this is because if you're trying to not eat gluten and you go to look at a food in the grocery store and you see, oh, it's made with kamut. Oh, that should be healthy. Well, it's wheat. So if you are trying to avoid gluten, having kamut in there will not be helpful. So it's kind of good to know all of these names if you're really trying to avoid eating gluten. And I'm just going to check into the comments for a minute. Just give me a sec. All right, let's continue sharing the screen. Wrong share. Hang on. Share the screen. Oh, there we go. Sorry. It's an art form doing these lives, especially when you only have one screen. It's recommended you have two, but I do not have two computer screens at the moment. So what is celiac disease? Celiac disease is one reason why people would completely remove gluten from their diet. And it's a very serious disease. It's an autoimmune disease, and it can lead to permanent damage to the small intestine. So if you have celiac disease and you continue to eat gluten, you will cause permanent damage to your small intestine over time. And this means that the small intestine cannot function properly and it cannot pull all of the nutrition that's in the food you eat out of the food and make it available to your body. So people that have celiac disease, especially the longer it goes on undiagnosed, can have very serious health problems long term. Slight typo there. They can have very serious health problems. So it's not something to take lightly. And approximately 1% of the population has celiac disease. It tends to run in families, but just because nobody in your family ever had it to your knowledge, it doesn't mean that you won't have a chance of having it. So if you think that you might have celiac disease, it's very important to speak to your doctor and get the question addressed. Now, what is gluten intolerance? So it's not an immune reaction. So it's different from celiac disease or a food allergy, which are all immune reactions. So when people have a gluten intolerance, they have trouble digesting gluten, and it will cause them problems, but it's not going to cause permanent damage to their small intestine like celiac disease. Some of the symptoms could be digestive problems. It also could be inflammation in your body, which can cause all kinds of other problems. Fatigue and mood challenges. There's many symptoms of gluten intolerance, which makes it hard to diagnose and figure out. But it is something that is not as risky long-term if you're not paying attention generally as celiac disease. I'm just going to, so if you have any questions, let me know. And let's continue. So many people with a gluten intolerance will self-diagnose, and I'm in that category. I have self-diagnosed that I do have a gluten intolerance. I don't think I have celiac disease, but I haven't yet seen my doctor about that. Sorry, I have to take a sip of water. I am going to see my doctor about that the next time I have my annual appointment. And if you do think you do have a gluten intolerance, it's a good idea to see your doctor just to rule out celiac disease, because it's a much stricter level of control, and you really need to know if you have it. So we don't know how many people have gluten intolerance because most people self-diagnose and they don't even necessarily talk to their doctors. They just stop eating wheat and they feel better. And do they have celiac disease or not? We don't know. So like I said, it's very important, if you think you have a problem with gluten, talk to your doctor about it and just get the correct diagnosis. So in Canada and the United States and most countries in the world, there are controls on how much gluten is allowed in a food that declares itself to be gluten-free. So in Canada and the United States, it's 20 parts per million, which is 0.002% or 0.0002. So it's a very small amount of gluten. And the reason why the limit was set at 20 parts per million is because most people with celiac disease can tolerate up to 20 parts per million of gluten in their food. But getting beyond 20 parts per million, some people with celiac disease will start to have problems. And by the time you get to about 50 parts per million, most people with celiac disease will have a problem. So if you have someone in your family, or if you know someone who has celiac disease and you're preparing food for them, you need to follow really strict protocols, because 20 parts per million is nothing. Like, look at this. In a regular white bread, it will have 1.24 grams of gluten in 100 grams, which would be about 5 slices. So, even just a couple of crumbs of bread on a cutting board, and then you prepare maybe a salad or a snack for somebody with celiac disease, it can make them sick. So when you do prepare food for somebody with celiac disease, you really need to have dedicated tools, or you need to thoroughly wash all your tools with soap and water before you use them to prepare food for somebody with celiac disease. And you really need to make sure that, you don't have like loose flour that could, float around the kitchen, and other foods that could potentially contaminate the food you're preparing. So putting gluten-free on a food, it's a claim. and it's controlled by laws and regulations in Canada, in USA, in England, in the EU, and Australia, New Zealand. So food plants, if they're going to make food that says gluten-free on it, they have to follow all the laws and regulations. And they're quite strict, and one of them is the 20 ppm. Plus, gluten is an allergen. So if it's present, it must be listed on the label. So when you buy a food that is gluten-free, it has to have less than 20 ppm of gluten. It has to tell you in the ingredient list what ingredients there are in the food. And then in the allergen claim, it has to tell you that gluten is in the food. And there's a bunch of other requirements as well. But those are the basic requirements that as a consumer, you should be aware of. So when a food claims to be gluten-free, the company, you should be able to have confidence that the food really is gluten-free. Now, some companies will choose to, in addition to just putting gluten-free on their foods, they will choose to have gluten-free certification. And this is always a good thing, because what happens with that is there's an annual audit where an auditor, a food compliance auditor, comes into the food plant every year and does a very thorough check. It's an entire day to make sure that they are following all the rules and regulations of the laws they have to follow, and also of the certification scheme that they're under. And I used to do that when I was a food compliance auditor. So it's one way to reassure customers and consumers that food plants have good control. So if you see a little logo that says gluten-free on it, that usually means that the company is certified. But it's not a requirement to be certified. Companies can put gluten-free on their food, but it's always, the consumer can feel more confident when the certification is present. And especially if you're somebody who really has celiac disease and really wants to be very, ensure that it's complete, everything is completely 100% gluten-free, then it's, it gives you extra confidence in the food. So let's go back and look at the next slide. So why did I stop eating gluten? I stopped at the beginning of November. So I was a jogger since I was 16 until 7 years ago. And jogging was part of my daily routine. And I loved it. It was a strong part of my identity. It was not only good for me physically, but it calmed me down. It made me energetic. I slept better. I ate better. I felt better when I was jogging. Then 7 years ago, I went dancing with a friend and a couple of people. And I woke up the next morning and I couldn't walk. I had severely injured my left knee. And I went to the doctor and they diagnosed it was osteoarthritis in my knee. And the doctor told me, don't ever jog again. Don't do any kind of impact sport, because the osteoarthritis is only going to get worse and your knee is only going to deteriorate more and you won't be able to walk. So just absolutely no impact sports. And I said to him, but I'm a jogger. And he just looked at me and he said, no jogging. But I said, but maybe when I'm better, when my knee is better, I can jog. He's like, never. You will never jog again. And that diagnosis was so devastating. And I grieved for several years. I'd say it took me about 5 years to kind of feel less pain around that loss of jogging in my life. And I mean, I know I could swim and I could bike and I could cross-country ski. And eventually I could walk, but it was a devastating diagnosis. And it took me 2 years before I could walk a few kilometers, and I had to wear my knee brace. And I said to myself, oh, I'm sure one day I'll be able to jog. I'm going to try. Well, every time I tried to jog, I couldn't do it. It was too much pain. Even a few steps, even just running half a block for the bus would kill me. So yeah, I couldn't jog. So I finally made peace with the fact that I would never jog again. And then the pandemic came, and I got a cold in September. And I thought that's kind of weird because nobody had been to any kind of public place in 3 days in my household. Then I got another one in November. And this time it's like, okay, neither my husband or I have been to a public place in 10 days. And cold germs just don't walk into your house when you open the door. So I thought, there's no way this is a cold, but I felt really sick, like a bad cold or a flu. So I stopped eating. I just kind of went and had a little bit of broth and rice for the day. And I woke up the next day and I'm like, oh, I feel a lot better. And that was my big clue. This has to be related to food, I said to myself. So I looked at what I'd been eating, and I had been preparing videos on breads available in my area, and I'd been eating a lot of bread. And I thought, I've been eating more bread than usual. I wonder if that's what it is. So I cut all gluten, all bread out of my diet. And 6 weeks later, I was jogging. Within a month, I felt so much better. And 6 weeks later, I was able to start jogging, which was like incredible, with no pain. And 2 months later, I noticed my energy was better. My mood was better. I felt 20 years younger. And yet, in the summer of 2020, I was in a situation where sometimes I couldn't even walk up the stairs. I had to go up the stairs on my hands and knees because my knees were so painful. And now it was both knees and my hips and my toes and my fingers. So it was not a good situation. And now I had no pain, and I was jogging, and I felt great, and I felt 20 years younger. So that's why I decided I have to cut gluten out of my diet. And if you like this content so far, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. So let's go continue. Well, so if you are going to eat gluten-free for whatever reason, what are grains and seeds that do not contain gluten? And there's a lot. Tapioca, potato, and arrowroot starch, rice flours, corn flour and cornmeal, almond and nut flours, chickpea and legume flours, quinoa flour and flakes, buckwheat flour, even though it's got wheat in it, it's gluten-free, oats, sorghum, amaranth, and teth flours. Teth is a seed. And then seeds like sesame, sunflower, pumpkin, all of those are naturally gluten-free. Well, so now I wanted to look at processed foods. And the reason why I want to look at processed foods, because a lot of people, especially if you're somebody who's been eating a lot of bread, a lot of pasta, you have a bagel or a waffle or a toast in the morning, and then you have a sandwich or a wrap or a ciabatta at lunch, and then you have pasta for dinner. So if you're used to eating a lot of gluten-containing foods, and you're thinking about going gluten-free, and you're going, what am I going to eat? What am I going to eat? Well, if we go back to the previous screen, you can see there's a lot of grains and seeds that naturally do not contain gluten. And there's a lot of gluten-free processed foods. But is switching your diet to just be, okay, I'm going to eat the same thing, or I'm going to eat the same way, but I'm just going to buy gluten-free waffles and gluten-free pasta and gluten-free bread and gluten-free cereal and all of that. Is it really the best strategy? So let's take a look. Here we have waffles with gluten, regular waffles, the frozen waffles that you buy and put in your toaster. And here we have the gluten-free waffles. So calories, they're the same, but look at the protein. The gluten waffles have a lot more protein than the gluten-free. The gluten-free have a little bit less fat. However, the gluten-free waffles have a lot more carbohydrates, which is not necessarily a good thing. And the fiber is the same. So there are some differences here. The main thing is that the gluten waffle has more protein and less carbohydrates. And the gluten-free waffles have less protein and more carbohydrates. And if we look at the ingredients list down here, I don't know if you can see it. So we've got the ingredients here for the gluten waffles. You see, it's a much simpler ingredient list. And then here we have the ingredient list for the gluten-free waffles. And you've got potato starch. Now, brown rice flour, that's not bad. First ingredient other than water. Then potato starch, that's not so great that it's so high up in the ingredient list. Corn flour, that's not too bad. And here we've got tapioca starch, sugar, and then where we've got all of these sweeteners in the form of juices. So that's a lot of sweeteners. And I guess it's to give it a bit more flavor, because gluten-free flours and starches tend to not have a huge amount of flavor unless they're made from beans. But when they're made from beans, they don't work in all foods. So now let's take a look at spaghetti. So here we have whole wheat spaghetti and gluten-free spaghetti. So gluten-free has more calories, which isn't necessarily good. The gluten-free has half the protein, which is not good. The fat's the same. The gluten-free has more carbohydrates, and it has very little fiber compared to the whole wheat. So once again, you can see the nutritional profile of the gluten-free version is not as good as the gluten version. And let's look at why that happens. So here we've got whole wheat flour. Look at the protein in whole wheat flour, 13.3 grams per 100 grams. So oats come close at 12.5. Quinoa actually has more protein, and almond flour. So they're good choices for a high protein content. Corn flour is not too far off either. And then we have brown rice flour. The starches, tapioca starch and potato starch, have no protein. So they are not good choices to be a main ingredient in your gluten-free food. And let's look at the fiber. So whole wheat flour will have 13.3 grams of fiber as well. Oats have 10, buckwheat flour has 10, quinoa has 4, corn flour has 7, almond flour has almost 7. Now tapioca starch has more fibers, almost 7. So, but still, we're talking about significantly less fiber in most of your gluten-free flours. So what does this mean? This means that when you're looking at an ingredient list for a gluten-free processed product, like, let's say the spaghetti. Now, the spaghetti actually has a very nice gluten-free ingredient list. White rice flour, brown rice flour, corn flour, quinoa flour. It would be better if there was no white rice flour. It would be better if it was just brown rice flour, corn flour, and quinoa flour. But, that's the ingredient list we've got here. But still, even with that better ingredient list, look at the protein. It's half. And if we look here at the waffles, so here we have brown rice flour, which isn't too bad, but then potato starch, corn flour, which isn't too bad, and then tapioca starch. So there's a fair amount of the two starches in here, and potato starch does not have any protein, and tapioca has some. So when you see arrowroot starch, potato starch, tapioca starch, and corn starch high up in an ingredient list for a gluten-free product, then you are going to get a significantly less protein and significantly less fiber compared to the wheat version. So if you're going to eat a lot of these gluten-free processed foods, it's going to lower the nutritional value of your diet. And if you're someone who eats a lot of gluten products and you're trying to go gluten-free, then it's okay as a short-term strategy to just transition to the gluten-free products that are available and eat them. But long-term, it's not a good eating plan because you're cutting your nutrition. And in North America, we have plentiful food for most people, but that doesn't mean we're eating healthy or nutritionally. So long-term, really just switching over to gluten-free processed foods is not a good strategy in terms of your nutrition and your health. But eating some is fine in moderation, just not huge amounts. So let's look at what you can eat on a gluten-free diet then. Well, anything that's unprocessed, that is not in the list of grains that I gave you before that contain gluten, you can eat it all. Whether you're vegetarian, vegan, meat eater, pescatarian, whatever it is, unprocessed, you can eat all of these foods. And you shouldn't need to worry about gluten. I didn't put gluten-free grains there, but that's because we already talked about it. And of course, gluten-free grains. Now, there is one thing you need to know about gluten-free grains. A gluten-free grain, if it doesn't claim to be gluten-free on the package, then it could have come into contact with gluten either on the farm or in the transport or in the mill or the processing. So there could be enough gluten in a grain that doesn't naturally contain gluten to make you sick if you have celiac disease. In my case, if I ate, let's say I just buy regular oats and I eat regular oats, which is what I do, it doesn't bother me because the amount of possible gluten in there that is there by accident isn't enough to bother me. But if you have celiac disease, there could be enough in the oats to bother you. So if you have celiac disease or a very severe gluten intolerance, then for the grains that are naturally gluten-free, you need to look for the ones that are gluten-free, that claim to be gluten-free, because what that means is that they were grown and transported and processed in gluten-free environments to ensure that there was no accidental contact with a gluten source. So to ensure that they keep their natural gluten-free status. So that's very important if you have celiac disease or a very severe gluten intolerance. You need to, even for the gluten-free grains, you need to buy ones that claim to be gluten-free, because that way they will be processed in a safe manner for you. But if you don't have celiac disease or such a severe intolerance, then you can just eat these regular grains, the regular gluten-free grains. So if you are going to eat processed foods, it's really important that you check the ingredients list, and you want to look for those flours and products that are much higher in protein, like corn flour, almond flour, quinoa flour, and brown rice flour is not too bad, and the ones that are higher in fiber. So corn flour, buckwheat flour, and oats, and almond flour. You really want to see those flours in the first few ingredients. And if you've got tapioca starch or potato starch or white rice flour, a little bit lower down, that's not so bad. But you really want to make sure that the product is not made only with tapioca starch or potato starch, or that it is way high up in the ingredient list. And a month ago, I bought this gluten-free flour mix, and I made gluten-free tortilla pie crust last night, and tortilla, of course, with the pie crust. And I was going to use this flour. So I looked at the ingredient list, which I hadn't done before, and I'm like, it's just starch. That's all it was, starch. And I thought, well, that's not good. That's not nutritious. So I ended up changing my recipe so that I was using some of bean flours, almond flour, and brown rice flour, and a little bit of that starch to make the pastry. Because I'm like, I'm not going to make a pastry with just starch. There was a recipe that called for me to make a pastry with just starch. And I'm like, I'm not going to do that. It's not nutritious. So really check the ingredients list for the flours that are higher in protein and fiber. And also check the allergen statement, because there are so many processed foods that have gluten, because it's a great thickener, and you wouldn't even expect gluten to be in there. But because wheat is so good at thickening, and because it has those elastic and structural properties, it's used in so many foods. So you really need to check the ingredients in the allergen statement to make sure that you don't have wheat or some source of gluten in that food. And I'll give you some examples of foods that, well, actually, we'll do that in a minute. Actually, I'm going to do that now. We'll talk about this in a minute. I've lost it. Yeah, I'll give you some examples of some foods that have gluten that might surprise you. Seitan and soy sauce, Seasonings, many seasoning mixes and gravy mixes have gluten because it's a thickener. And also when you make gravy, if you make a roux, if you know how to make a roux, what it is, it's melted butter, wheat, and then your liquid. So any gravy mix that is based on a roux is going to have wheat in it. Some salad dressings have wheat as a thickener. Fish and meat coatings will often have breadcrumbs or wheat, and many soups and stews. And that's just a small list. There's many other products that also have gluten, and you would be surprised. So it's really important that you look at the ingredient list before you buy a product, which I have learned now because I went and bought this starch mixture, which I will use slowly, but I'm not going to use it as my main gluten-free flour mix. So here's some examples of things you could eat on a gluten-free diet. So for breakfast, if you're used to having toast and eggs or bagel or croissant, whatever it is, you could switch to smoothies, soups, salads, leftovers, porridge, oatmeal, chia pudding, and there's tons of great recipes on how to make all of these things. I often will have a smoothie for my breakfast, and I love having leftover soup and salad for breakfast. I mean, I can eat anything for breakfast because it's one of my main meals of the day. And some examples of things that you could have for lunch on a gluten-free diet: tostadas, which is a corn cooked tortilla, corn tortillas, salads, nori wrap. So if you ever buy sushi, you know that seaweed that they wrap the sushi in, that's called nori. You can make your own. You can make your own wraps with it. Lettuce wraps. I do lettuce wraps all the time, and it works really well, and they're great. Tacos should be gluten-free. Soups and salads that are gluten-free, and leftovers. I mean, leftovers are great at any time of the day, in my book. And what can you eat on a gluten-free diet for dinner? Well, most cuisines of the world actually don't have a lot of gluten in them. So cuisines, Chinese, Asian, African, Indian, Mexican, and South American foods, and indigenous from North America, there are tons of recipes that don't have any gluten. There are some recipes that may have gluten, but there's a lot that don't. Make sure you buy a gluten-free soy sauce, though, or tamari sauce. Hearty stews and chilies and large salads, roasted vegetables with a good protein. So instead of having, pasta, which is what I used to do, you can do roasted vegetables with a side dish of brown rice. I recommend brown rice because it's a lot more nutritious than white rice. And you could have your meat or your legumes or whatever it is as your protein, or a salad and rice, or you can mix it together, roasted vegetables with rice. So there's a lot of, there's quinoa also. Quinoa is nice. Now I'm going to tell you my story about quinoa. I'm not crazy about quinoa just by itself. So if I'm going to have quinoa, I'm going to either mix it in with something, or I'm going to put some kind of sauce or gravy on it, because I can't just sit down and eat quinoa by itself. I just, as a side dish, like I can do that with rice, but not with quinoa. So what I do is I cook quinoa and I portion it into small containers, and then I freeze it. And that way, when I'm having a salad or I'm having soup, I just put a little bit in, and then I'm getting my extra protein. And but the quinoa, it's very mild. It doesn't have a strong flavor, so it kind of mixes in with whatever I'm eating, and that's how I like to have my quinoa. Buckwheat groats, roasted buckwheat groats. That's another grain that you can have as a side dish instead of pasta. And you can usually buy them in the grocery store, but if you can't find them in your local grocery store, then you could try a Eastern European grocery store. They will generally have roasted buckwheat groats, or kasha, as it's known in Polish, and I believe also in Russian. So that's another grain that you can eat. And snacks. What kind of snacks can you have on a gluten-free diet? Well, cornbread, as long as you don't put in regular flour, will be gluten-free. Any kind of gluten-free banana, zucchini, carrot bread or muffins, oat bars and products, seed bars and crackers, almond bars and products. These will all be gluten-free. And I've got a tip here for you. When you're going to make your own gluten-free products, if you're going to use a flour mix that has any kind of legume flour, so chickpea or any kind of legume flour, it's fine for savory dishes. But legume flours generally have a stronger flavor than the other flours, gluten-free flours, and that flavor does not always go well with sweet things. So, for example, in cornbread or in gluten-free cookies or gluten-free cake, I would not use a bean flour or a chickpea flour because it will give it a taste that just, it doesn't work. So in that case, you're better off to use your almond flour, your quinoa flour, your brown rice flour, your corn flour, and oats, of course. So let's look at some tips. So short term, you can transition to the gluten-free processed alternatives, but long term, you really need to change the way you eat. And I know some people feel that change is a dirty word, but change is actually an opportunity for you to embrace new things. Change can be a great opportunity to learn new things. So let's look at change in a positive way. So how should you change what you eat? You should eat more vegetables, legumes, seeds, and gluten-free grains. You should get more plant foods into your diet and more fiber, and especially because by cutting out gluten, you are cutting out a source of protein and fiber. So you need to make sure that you add that back into your diet with legumes and seeds and plants and nuts. So you need to start thinking about ways to change the way you eat. And in North America, we generally, a lot of people do not have the most healthy diet. We may have a lot of food, like I said before, but that doesn't mean we eat healthy. So just changing the way you eat to include more of these plant foods is nutritious for everyone. Even if you keep gluten in your diet and you can eat gluten, just adding more vegetables and legumes and seeds and nuts and more plants and more fiber that are cooked in a healthy way and not French fries, I'm not talking about French fries, is beneficial for everyone. And then look at cuisines from other countries where gluten is much less present in the cooking and the recipes. And you'll find a host of new foods to try. And try new foods. Go to your grocery store and pick up something that you've never eaten before and go on the internet and find a recipe for it. So, for example, I bought some cabbage to make my latest recipe, which is 4-vegetable coleslaw, and you can find that on my YouTube channel, Debbie Esplin. And I've got a lot of cabbage, because a little bit of cabbage, once you chop it up, it turns into a huge amount of salad. So I was looking at ways to use up cabbage, and I discovered sauteed cabbage, and it's delicious. And I never would have thought of sauteing cabbage. So that recipe's coming soon. So how do you implement change? How do you do change? Well, generally you should do one change at a time. So implement one change per week, in a week, and then do that one change every week for the entire month. So maybe you decide, okay, I'm going to buy a new food. Let's say you decide I'm going to buy green cabbage. And then once a week, I'm going to do a new recipe with green cabbage. Or I'm going to buy almond flour, and once a week, I'm going to do a new recipe with almond flour. And do that for a whole month. And in that month of 30 days or 31 days, what will happen is that you will retrain your taste buds to like the new food. But it takes a month for your taste buds to adapt to a new food. And it also takes a month for us to integrate a new habit. And it may even take a bit longer than a month. If you're only doing it once a week, it could take a bit longer, but it takes at least a month to integrate a new habit. And don't add a new change until you feel fully comfortable with the change that you implemented. And then move on to the next change. So that's really the best strategy to start changing how you eat. Do it slowly. So maybe you say, okay, maybe you like to have eggs and toast every morning for breakfast. So initially you go to gluten-free bread for your toast, but then maybe you decide, okay, you know what? I'm going to try egg with corn muffins, or I'm going to try egg with zucchini bread, gluten-free zucchini bread. And you toast it and you butter it, and you even put jam on it. Or I'm going to try egg with a corn tortilla. Start changing. Maybe a week of different changes you could make to if you're doing it as an experiment and you just want to see if you feel better. Lost my screen. Let me go back. If you're doing it as an experiment and you just want to see if you feel better or not, that's fine. But if you're like me and I react quite negatively when I eat gluten now, or if you have celiac disease, then remember your motivation. So, for example, after being gluten-free for 2 months, I started adding in a little bit of gluten just to see, can I tolerate a little bit? And I discovered that I really can't even have a couple of crackers. A half a cracker, a quarter of a cracker, I'm okay. But 2 or 3 crackers, a day or 2 in a row, I can't. I feel it and I don't feel well, and it messes up my digestion, and I really don't feel well. So now that I've been gluten-free since November, I feel so good. And the fact that I have jogging back in my life is so huge. And I have no joint pain. And I can run up and down the stairs like a kid. And I have tons of energy. I can even get up from the floor better. My life has improved enormously in terms of my physical ability, my strength, my energy. That's a really strong motivation for me to not eat gluten. So you need to keep your motivation in mind. And as I said before, if you do feel better without gluten, then it is important to see your doctor at some point and discuss this with him, because really, if you do have celiac disease, you want to know. So it's important to get your doctor to figure out if you should be tested for celiac disease or not. Another tip for having a nutritious gluten-free diet is cook more at home, because there are so many processed foods in our environment, and they're not necessarily healthy. And even if they don't have gluten, but they might have gluten, when you cook at home, you control your nutrition. And instead of buying the gluten-free waffles that are significantly less uh, healthy in terms of protein and pulses. So cooking at home is a really powerful way to improve to have a healthy diet. It will also save you money. Cooking is also very creative. And if you're not good at cooking, don't worry. On my website, on my YouTube channel, and on my blog, 95% of the recipes I do are fast, easy, healthy, and they are geared to people that either don't have time to cook or don't have a lot of cooking knowledge. Every once in a while, I will do something that's more complex, like when I am going to present the gluten-free tortilla in a little while. That's a little more challenging, but the majority of my recipes are really easy. So cooking at home is a powerful way to have a healthy diet. And we already looked at this. So there are, many, many, many foods that have gluten. And as I said before, it's really important to read the ingredients list before you buy any food that is not in its raw, natural state. And here are some resources if you want to know more, either about celiac disease or gluten intolerance. This is the Canadian site for celiac disease. And then in the US, they have these 2 sites here. And you can learn a lot more there. And I know on the Canadian site, you can actually download a list of foods that might surprise you that have gluten and hidden sources of gluten. So these are good references or good resources to look into. And we're just about finished now. So I'm just going to wrap this up. I hope that this is going to be helpful to people that are trying to have gluten out of their diet. And I thank you very much for watching. And if you're going to watch the replay, please do put comments. If you have any questions, ask me a question or tell me if you think you might have a problem with gluten. Do you feel better when you don't eat gluten? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to discuss this with you. And if you like this video, if you found value in this information, then click that like button if you're on YouTube or if you're on Facebook. Subscribe to my YouTube channel and check in with my Facebook page and click the bell on my YouTube channel. What that does is that tells you every time I upload new content, and share this video with your friends and your family. And I really appreciate your interest and your support. And I appreciate everybody who's subscribed to my channel, who's helping me grow. And do check out my YouTube channel and my blog. My blog is called The Daily Basil, so it's thedailybasil.com. And I post all my recipes there as well. And on my blog, I also post a recipe card that you can download and either save on your computer or print. It's free of charge. You have that. So check that out. And I also have a newsletter that comes out twice a month. And every issue, I share information about food that I don't share anywhere else. I don't share on my YouTube channel and I don't share it on my Facebook page. So every issue, I'll talk about some aspect of food to help you learn more about food. And in the process of doing the research, I learn a lot more about food. So the last issue that came out was all about crustaceans. And of course, there's other information in the newsletter as well. So check that out. You can sign up for my newsletter. I will also put the links to those 3 celiac organizations in the video description below. And I want to thank you very much for watching. And I hope you're going to be healthy and well. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye.